Okay, there we go. Okay, all I'm
Program
getting
dealing
is
with the news. So I hope you'll join us each week. We're going to divide up the first half hour. We'll be talking about news events. And then in the second half hour, we're going to start off this first show. We're going to be news, which is Greece. And to start us off on that, let's go to Chris Erie. Chris.
Hi, Elgin. Greece is a subject of much concern in Europe at the moment, on the basis that at the moment we don't know whether there's going to be it's not 11th hour anymore, or 15th hour arrangement to bail them out and restructure their debt load. Otherwise, there is the distinct possibility that they'll have to leave the euro and possibly Europe as well, which Europe as a whole doesn't want.
Just south of York, England. He's a retired lawyer.
Oh.
Yeah, I think that was me dropping out, wasn't it?
Well, I didn't hear you for a bit, so I actually started talking.
Good.
For what it's worth.
I didn't get to hear the end of your comments. Tony, do you have any thoughts on this?
Well, it's very interesting because through my wife, I have ties to Greece. Mm-hmm. And so anything that happens in Greece filters into the family conversation. I think we have to look at it in the terms of the global economy. Everybody's saying Greece is not a big deal, but they're still people. And my gut feeling is if we impose severe restrictions on a small number of people, we're going to find a way to impose the restrictions on a large number of people. Excuse me for one moment. I'll be right back.
Okay. Well, at that point, I'll jump in, and for me, I think it's as tragic it is for the Greek people. I think one of the big issues here, and it's not restricted to Greece, is the fact of debt. You have people who run up huge amounts of debt. We have this on an individual basis. People here in the United States, we get credit cards, they go out, they spend, they far outspend themselves, and they get themselves into trouble. I think on a bigger scale, we have that's what's happening in Greece, but it's not just Greece. I mean, America is hardly one to talk when we have a $18 trillion deficit, and we're currently spending far beyond our means. We're not quite to the point where Greece is yet, but we've had a number of cities in this country who have gone bankrupt because they can no longer afford to make and fulfill all the promises that the politicians have made. So I don't necessarily think that Greece is that abnormal. I think it's sort of the first ones, and the real thing we have to deal with is how do you get a government to live within its means? And we label it austerity, but whether you call it austerity or not, when you've got a country that's spending far more than it's taking in, that it's generating, where does the money come from?
Well, part of the if I may.
Certainly.
Okay, if I may, I think part of the problem also in Greece is that the wealthy are allowed to pull their funds out of the country. They're hiding their money. They're not paying their taxes, and they're putting the burden on the middle and lower classes. I agree. You got to live within your means, but when a good portion of your means is disappearing through other avenues, Liechtenstein and Cayman Islands, you're faced with a problem. And this is, I think, a greater problem in Greece, that the rich aren't carrying their fair share of the load, which echoes a lot of what's going on in this country as well.
Chris, you have a comment on that?
Yeah. Oh, I agree. The problem of very wealthy individuals and multinational corporations not paying any taxes affects us too. The Greek government has historically been particularly bad at that. However, when it comes to the question of, yes, they've got to live within their means, actually, in the fairly brief period that Syriza has been in power, they have managed to produce a current account surplus. They've also reduced employment by something over 30%. If they impose any more austerity, the employment's going to collapse further, their tax base is going to collapse further, and they're going to be able to pay nothing back. What's being attempted to be imposed on them is austerity beyond any kind of reason. Also, of course, they've been bailed out by IMF and European Bank, except they haven't, because what those two did was buy out debt to private banks, which were not prepared to take the risk that was associated with the very high interest rates they were extracting from Greece in the first place. I think there's a huge mistake in bailing out private banks that's at the root of some of this as well.
I would point out about the taxes and the rich. I mean, they often, and whether rightly or wrongly, get blamed. But as an article in the Wall Street Journal pointed out, that according to Greek officials, the vast majority of the tax evasion actually occurs at the lower and moderate ends of the income scale. So one of the things about Greece is that it has a sort of a tradition of avoiding taxes and hiding taxes. And one of the articles I saw said that if most of the entrepreneurs, the people like the doctors and the people who own small businesses and stuff, who essentially work for themselves, if they were to report their unearned income, that would take up 31% of Greece's deficit. But I still think you come back to the big problem. They have a debt to GDP ratio of 177%, and somehow that's got to be closed. So I think that's where the real issue comes in terms of the details. How that gets solved in Greece, I'm not an expert on the Greek economy, but I do see the same. To me, it's more like the canary in the coal mine. What's happening in Greece is going to be happening in a lot of other countries that have a long history of spending more than they're taking in, and that includes the United States.
You won't get an argument out of me on that.
Any other comments on Greece before we move on to the next topic?
I think that'll do. Yeah.
And I'm sure it probably won't be the last time we talk about debt and deficits and countries overspending. So I think they're the first ones. Well, our second topic is going to be the recent Pope's encyclical dealing with sort of a global warming and capitalism. And my real question is considering everything that's going on in the world with Christians being slaughtered and persecuted and sold into slavery around the world, is global warming and capitalism really the biggest problems facing the church today? There's a Pope a little bit misplaced in terms of his emphasis. Tony, you want to start us off on this one?
Well, speaking as a Methodist, or United Methodist, rather, a couple things. A lot of people, when you look at the church today, the church itself, at least from my viewpoint, tends to worry more about getting by into the pulpit of pew. And this has created a mindset amongst the non-church that's all they care about. Regarding climate change, I'm not going to argue that we shouldn't be saying more about the persecution of Christians in other countries where there is a physical and legitimate persecution. Coming from where I come from, too many people call those who say that Christians are being persecuted here in America need to reevaluate their stance. Let's leave it at that. But yeah, there is clearly a call for a balance. Whether we're going to get it or not, I don't know. Now, as far as climate, Genesis says in the book of Genesis, we were stated to be the stewards of this place. We were to take care of this place. That's, if we're not taking care of the planet, we're not taking care of our home. So from the very beginning, it's always been take care of the planet. Climate change, the Pope, for me, coming out and saying we got to consider climate change, that's a great thing because he's making us aware of our role in the whole process. Capitalism, I'll say for a few minutes later.
Chris?
Yeah, I think we should have expected this from this Pope because they elected a Franciscan, and care of the environment and the poverty of Christians are the two bedrocks of the Franciscan order. I mean, they call the female cloistered Franciscans the Poor Clares, which heightens the idea that they do not believe that Christians should be in the business of the pursuit of money. So yes, I would have expected a Franciscan worthy of the name to be going in both those directions. I'm just pleased that once he's got up to the elevated heights of Cardinal and beyond, that he hasn't forgotten his roots. As far as Christians being persecuted, I am horrified at the amount of persecution that's going on in the Middle East and some parts of Africa at the moment. But what do we want the Pope to do about it? The Pope has influence over Catholics and to some extent other Christians by association. He has no power over the people who are doing the persecuting. Unless we're looking at going back to the Church Militant and the Crusades, which I think were a horrendously bad idea, there really isn't very much that the Pope can be doing to combat the persecution.
Two quick comments.
I would say that as Pope, he has what in the United States we call the bully pulpit. He has the ability to raise issues and raise consciousness, and I'm not arguing for the Catholic Church to call for another crusade. Although I think those are somewhat distorted in our history books. I think they were not shall we say Christianity's shining moment. But I think to me, I fall into what would be clearly the I don't know if I like the term global warming denier, but I am definitely a global warming skeptic from my point of view. I mean, I've been watching this whole debate from when it was global cooling, the transition into global warming, then transition into climate change, and it seems like for most of my life we've had about 10 years to live. So before everything becomes a disaster. So maybe it's a little bit of cry wolf on the part of the now called climate change people, but I'm definitely in the skeptical camp. So I'm a little concerned. I would say transitioning a little into capitalism here. I would say that capitalism is much more of a solution to the world's poverty problems than it is a cause. I mean, one of the stats I put out in my book, what is wrong with social justice is the fact that over the last 40 years or so, we've seen the worst form of poverty, people living on $1 a day type poverty or worse, cut 80%, and it's been cut not by aid programs and things like this. It's largely been cut by the growth of economies, and in places like Africa, the emergence of things called microcredit, where people can take out extremely small amounts of money, at least from a Western perspective, in terms of loan, but enough to start a small business and to make them self-sufficient. And we've seen that form of poverty cut 80%. So there's still a lot to do. That, to me, capitalism is more of a solution than a cause of the problem.
Going back to your comment, Elton, go ahead. Your comment about the bully pulpit, my comment was going to be, I think it was Stalin who once said the Pope has no army. So he has to do it from a bully pulpit type view, as do most people. I don't have an immediate solution for the stopping the persecution, and I agree with Chris. The history of the Crusades, our history, we're finding more and more that our history, the Christian Crusades, were a bad idea, and that's working against us when we're now. So we have a lot of back history that we have to correct in order to make anything we do moving forward positive. Capitalism, I agree with you about that the microcredits. The critical thing is to be able to expand that beyond a limited scale. I'm torn between the idea of capitalism as it is designed. I keep thinking, I'm trying to remember, I believe it was Mark Twain said, or it was either Mark Twain or Winston Churchill, said that of all the capitalism was the worst, or was a bad idea, except that it was better than anything else. From my standpoint, it's always been a matter of, does everybody have an opportunity? And that's where the micro loans come in. If they have the ability to get involved, then it works. If they don't have the ability to involve, I keep thinking of all the factories in Bangladesh, which are more death traps than they are factories. And we're not saying to the American public, the American public buys the clothes that are manufactured there because they're cheap. So you've got to say to the American public, do you want to, you're supporting this, do you want to keep supporting this? And that's my take on the capitalism. Capitalism will work provided it's designed to help all the workers and not just the owners. And then my wife just whispered at me, child labor. The places Thailand and elsewhere where there's child labor. The Nike factories.
Yeah, I think how you define capitalism is, I think, a huge part of the issue. By the way, the quote was from Winston Churchill, but it concerned democracy. Democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others that have been tried. Although I think it applies very well to capitalism as well. Chris, you want to jump in?
The theory of capitalism, when you take it as I seem to remember you do in your book on the social gospel, sounds wonderful. The trouble is that doesn't seem to be how it actually operates. The more I see of the way it actually operates, the more it seems to create larger and larger organizations which benefit more and more a very few people at the top, and which drive down wages as far as they can. They've now got the opportunity of driving down the wages by employing people in other countries, which is wonderful for the people in the other countries who, by their standards, start getting paid reasonable amounts of money. It's terrible for our workers. And, of course, the profits are earned in the middle. And I think the states, was it yourself, Elgin, who said that the states has a large amount of small business? We may be slightly ahead in the progression there. Small business is vanishing from the high streets in this country, and has been doing for the last 40 years or so. Small shops largely cannot survive. We have chains. The chains pay very low wages. The profits go somewhere else. Sometimes the somewhere else is out of this country. Certainly that seems to be the case with the chains of coffee shops. The ones that go out of the country tend not to pay any tax either. In the way it actually operates, I find that capitalism has no regard for people. It only has regard for money. And from my point of view, as the love of money is the root of all evil, capitalism is proposing a positively satanic system.
Okay. I disagree with that, but we're at the bottom of the hour, and this is actually a great transition. I don't know if you planned it that way. Before we go into our second half hour, where we will be talking more about the concept of a Christian economics. So I'm sure a lot of these topics will come back up. In fact, I know they will come back up because I'll bring them back up. But before we move along, I know you both are authors, and if you'd like to put in a plug for a book that you've written or for your websites or something, why don't you take this time to give us a short little plug, Chris?
I have nothing purchasable. I blog at airlines.energian.net on a regular basis on matters of liberal, radical, and unusual theology, mostly, and spirituality.
Okay. Tony?
Well, I'm working on a book for Henry called The Science of Creation. It's kind of a primer or study guide for those who need to understand what actually took place from the moment of creation to the present time. I was telling somebody, and for the benefit of my publisher, I'm stuck in the first 3 minutes right now, trying to get I could write a very scientific and theoretical document, but I want it to be something that's readable. So I want to just slogging my way through trying to get all the various things done. My blog is Thoughts from the Heart on the left, and there I write on a variety of things: chemistry, science education. That's my primary area. I try to write a weekly meditation on the lectionary series. I was for 20-some years. I was a lay speaker in the United Methodist Church. I retired from that, but I still like to keep in touch because there's a couple people that may call me at the last minute, and I always have to be prepared. That's what I'm doing.
Sounds good. And I guess my two books that would be most relevant to this discussion would be Preserving Democracy, What the Founding Fathers Knew, What We Have Forgotten, and How It Threatens Democracy. And then my other book, What is Wrong with Social Justice? And those are both pretty much available anywhere. And I do blog occasionally at hushbeck.com. All right, let's move into our second segment, which is dealing with the question of, is there such a thing as a Christian economics? I know Chris ended with the idea that capitalism is satanic, or at least has satanic roots. If we switch to the other side, if that, for sake of argument, is correct, which I don't think it is, but we'll come to that in a minute. But if that, for sake of argument, is correct, what's the flip side? What would be the Christian economic view? And let me start off with a little bit with, since I didn't get a chance to end up commenting on the last part, I do believe that capitalism, first off, let me say I don't believe there's a, quote, Christian economics, but I believe in an economics that is going to be what is going to work best for improving people's lives. And I think history is pretty clear that the best economic system so far has been capitalism. But I think that does require a few qualifiers in the sense that I view capitalism as having two key components, and this is something I discuss in my book, What's Wrong with Social Justice. But the two key components to make capitalism work is you have to push for consumer-based. It can't be centered around suppliers, but it has to be centered around consumers. And I believe that's because everybody is a consumer. Not necessarily everybody is a supplier, but everybody, including businesses, are consumers. So the focus of economics policy has to be towards consumers. It has to be towards providing choice and competition, so that if you don't like one particular place, if you don't like Walmart, I mean, I have lots of people tell me Walmart's a horrible place, and then I ask them, well, why do you shop there? Well, because they have the best prices. Okay. Put your money where your mouth is. If you don't like what they do, go to someplace else. There's a reason they have the prices they do. It's because they have the policies they do. In relation to one other quick comment. Oh, excuse me. One other quick comment is some of the bad aspects of capitalism, i.e., Chris pointed out in terms of centering on bigger and bigger businesses. I think there's a direct tie between that and the size of government, because the bigger government is, the more likely it can impose things that are a burden to small business. And you see, for example, large corporations find it very profitable to influence government to write regulations they know that they can implement, but their smaller competitors will have a very difficult time with. So I think you get what is called crony capitalism, where you get an alliance between the bigger businesses, the bigger banks, the bigger stores, the bigger industries, and the government itself. So I think there's a definite link between having concentration of big business and the size of government. But that's my view. Why don't we start with Tony?
Well, I'll go back to the founder of Methodism, John Wesley, and he had three basic rules. He had no problem with anybody earning large amounts of money. Rule number one is earn as much as you can. And in case in point, he was one of the highest paid ministers of his time in England. The second caveat, or second rule, was that you save all you can, rather than spending it foolishly. And his third rule was that you give as much as you can. Now, I think Chris could understand this. When John Wesley was alive, he was confounding the what would have been the 18th century equivalent of what is called inland revenue, because he was making all this money, but he had nothing to show for it because he was giving it all away. This also caused his second wife to get really ticked at him because she never had any money to spend. If capitalism is to be, for me, whatever the system is, if it doesn't show equality across the board, if the money is going to the, if the purpose of the company is to give money to the shareholders at the expense of the worker, it's not, to me, that's not fair. I mean, I have been a union member, not just as a teacher, but I used to be a member of the UAW. So I guess you could say it was a real, for some people that's a real union. I'm working on the level and I'm putting out a good product. I want to know that I have an opportunity to, through my wages, buy that product that I'm making. And I sometimes wonder if that's the case with capitalism today, that the worker, here in America, the issue is not a minimum wage, but a living wage. And there is a big difference between what is minimally required and what is necessary to actually live in this part of New York. We're 70 miles north of New York City. A living wage is roughly $12 an hour, and that's just basic living. Capitalism, as it appears to me, and I'm having to pull back from 30 years ago when I was in college in my economics course. Capitalism to me is not focusing on the worker. And going back, by the way, to an earlier thing we were discussing, I couldn't help but laugh. I think, Chris, you pointed out that the Pope was Franciscan and that this was what was to be expected. And I remember a few years ago the social justice movement that was taking place in the Catholic Church in Latin America, and there was a change in the popes, and every one of those priests that was in Latin America pushing for the work for the people literally was told, shut up. I'm glad my memory's not failing me, Chris. Thank you for nodding.
Well, that was more liberation theology, which we could probably have a long discussion on whether that's pushing for the people or what liberation theology was. I am not a very big fan of liberation theology. I did some of my work on college on, for example, Ernesto Cardenal and the Gospel Solantaname, which was in small town Nicaragua. So I actually supported the Pope's restricting liberation theology. But Chris, you want to jump in there real quick before we get too far sidetracked?
So much there. Yeah, I don't see this connection of big business with big government at all. What I actually see is that big business is far more able to buy governments. If the government is of a small country, it's relatively small in its own power, and I actually see governments as our only protection against predatory big business. As we're getting to sort of 3/4 of an hour-ish, the basic topic you started off with was you didn't believe there was a Christian economics. I believe there actually is a Christian economics, and it's set out in Acts 4:32 onwards, where there's a description of what the church was doing. Now that sounds incredibly like a communistic society, where everything is held in common. I think there is a Christian economics. My problem is I am not certain that that is viable, which I think was the big issue that you, Elgin, were raising in your social gospel book to some extent, and earlier. The system we have that works is capitalism. However, I do not necessarily see that because it works is a reason for us to say, therefore Christians should follow that, rather than what is laid down as the ideal for Christians in the Bible. If it is impractical, which I suspect it is, because I've long suspected that one of the reasons why Paul was going around collecting cash from the churches in Asia was that the Jerusalem and Palestinian Christians had run out of money due to being as described in Acts 4. If that's not viable, then can we not find a middle way between the ideal that we are told is what we should be doing and what I frankly think is bowing to impersonal forces which crush people?
Well, I think this is where come back in a little bit more of a defense of capitalism here. I think I would reject the idea that capitalism is grounded in greed. I don't think it is, and in fact, as someone who teaches at teaches, I have an MBA and I teach business classes. It's one of the things I refer to the paradox of business, which is that in a capitalistic society, your main goal is to collect money, to get profit. On the other hand, if that is your main goal, you will go out of business, because who wants to go shop at such a place? So to be successful in business, you have to be concerned and pay attention to your customers. You have to meet some need of your customer, and you have to be aware of that customer, what that customer wants, and what they're willing to pay, because you can provide the best service. I mean, there are plenty of hotels that provide wonderful service. I would love to go there. I don't have the money. More at Motel 6, or not sleeping in my car or whatever. And I've done both. So to be successful in business, you have to be focused on your customer. It means you must be focused on giving them something, and they're perceiving that it's worth them giving you something back. So it's not so much greed that drives capitalism, but it's the mutual exchange, the mutual, I'm going to provide something to you that you really want that will make your life better, and you're going to give me something back, which we, in an earlier forms, it was a barter system, but we've now, our economies have advanced that, we can do all the exchange now in money. And what I see the problem is when you get into positions where you don't have the competition. So you don't have the ability to make a choice as a consumer, because you have only one place. I can remember back when AT&T was the only telephone company, and you had no choice. You had to go to AT&T. Now we've got this multitude of providers and even communications forms across the internet like this. I have a choice. I can have a phone in my house. I can use a cell phone. I can just use my computer on the internet. And that choice means these companies have to provide something for me. And in that exchange is where capitalism lies. To me, we're going back to government. Where I see that breaking up is with big businesses, because they can put in the regulations. Dodd-Frank, which is a major banking bill here in the United States, it was put in after the last economic problems. What that has basically done is it's driven little banks out of business. I can't tell you how many times I've had to change banks, not because my bank was a bank I didn't like, but because it got bought out by a bigger bank, and I had no choice. If I didn't like this bank, so I had to go someplace else. And that's what I'm seeing. Before Dodd-Frank, we had on average 100 banks a year start up. Since Dodd-Frank, the 6 or 7 years since it's been in place, we've had one bank start up. Not 100 a year, but one bank total. And that's because smaller banks, we actually have many smaller banks going out of business because the regulation focuses on moving people up into the bigger banks, because that's just those are the ones who can afford the lawyers. In my book, I have a comment by Theodore Roosevelt, one of the early progressives, who pointed out when he was in the New York legislature that he was asked by one of the railroad companies to shepherd a bill through the legislature because there was no controversy about it. Everybody supported it. The railroad supported it. The people in place supported it. Everybody supported it, and they wanted it to be done, quote, the right way, and they knew Theodore Roosevelt would do it the right way. And they ran into roadblocks by other politicians, and eventually they had to pull the bill away from Theodore Roosevelt and give it to another legislator who was not quite as, so we say, scrupulous or careful, so that they could essentially, so the right people could get paid off so that the bill could actually get passed. So I see corruption not as big business corrupting government, but I actually see it as both sides corrupting each other. You have to have someone willing to pay and someone willing to be paid off, and oftentimes its government is demanding as much as they are getting received.
Well, I think what you've just pointed out is there such a thing as Christian economics? And I would say yes. When you operate where under the system that you just described, where it's, I'll scratch, where there's bribery, corruption, whatever you want, the lobby, when you look at the lobbyists today, that's clearly not a Christian attitude. And going back to what I said, if I'm working in an environment where I'm, I won't shop at Walmart, partially because Walmart got a bill, maybe I would if it was reasonable. They make the advertisement that their stuff is made in the USA. It's not. It's made in China, but it's not. It's finished in the United States, and that allows them, through their bill that they got through Congress, to say it was made in the United States. It's poor quality. Yeah, I agree with you. What you said earlier. Everybody says, "Oh, I don't like Walmart. They're lousy." And when a Walmart comes into a small town, the small businesses, as Chris was saying, I don't think you got Walmarts in England, Chris, but put up some big walls. When Walmart moves into an area, small business dies because they cannot compete. I won't support Walmart simply because the low prices they're bringing in is low quality. And I'm one person, but one person with three people make a movement. And that's the Christian thing. If I'm going to buy something that I know is made perhaps with illegal workers or is in sweatshop conditions overseas, I try to avoid that. And that's I think the economy or the economics is not in the business or the government, but rather in the individual. What am I going to do to move the economy to benefit all people and not just a select few?
I think we're going to see some changes in our economy too. I mean, one example that's fairly recent, new innovation is, for example, Uber. Uber is a company that acts as a sort of a taxi service, and that you don't need government to get involved. And one of the big issues in a lot of places, like you have to get permission by the city to run a taxi, which means some places are called medallions. To get a medallion is very expensive. They're very limited, and it makes being a taxi company very lucrative. Uber comes in, and anybody who meets certain qualifications in terms of driving record and criminal background check and stuff like that can become a driver for Uber. And when you drive in Uber, you basically use your cell phone, you call for a car using their app, the car shows up, you're able to rate the driver can rate you, you can see what need is there, you can see if this driver is getting good reviews or bad reviews, you can, which you can't do before. So I think the technology is going to change a lot of how the economy evolves and move it, if it's allowed to, move it away from government managed and controlled and more into things like Uber, where we have the ability to judge for ourselves.
Well, the thing for me, and I think Uber is going to have to tighten up their system. From what I gather, their background checks aren't always the best, and it's an evolving thing. But like I said, their background checks have proven over, and a number of things that I've seen pop up in the news. There's some questions about the character of the individuals that they're using, or that they're hiring, or letting represent them.
Yeah.
Because there's some issue as, are they employees or are they contractors?
They're contractors.
But that's an issue in California.
Yeah. But again, you'll have the whole issue of when someone pulls up in a state-certified taxi, what is their background check? What is their, I mean, at least with Uber, you have the experience of previous drivers to go on. When someone pulls up in a taxi in New York, do you have any idea who the person behind the wheel is?
No, I've never, I agree that I don't know who the driver is, but though I see the, ID and, the medallion, there's a lot, you take that risk anytime you interact with anybody.
Yeah.
Because it's just like, well, this morning, now I paid cash, but what would have happened if I had, a couple of years ago, I went out to dinner. My wife and I went out to dinner. The next thing I know, the manager's coming back apologizing profusely that my credit card is lost. From the time the waiter took it from the table to the cash register and got my ticket, he lost my credit card.
Ouch.
I mean, I'm on my phone. I'm not worried about the fact I'm getting dinner free. I'm on my phone killing that card.
Yep.
He may have been, as the case was, the waiter was a klutz. But anytime you interact with an individual, there has to be some guarantee that that individual meets certain requirements. You're in Milwaukee, right?
Wausau.
Elton?
Wausau,
Sorry?
Wisconsin.
Wausau. Okay, I got cousins up there, by the way. What did Governor Walker just recently attempt to do, which I believe the legislature voted it down, was say anybody with a college degree could teach in the public schools, which, if I understand right, would eliminate the governor of Wisconsin as a possible public school teacher since he doesn't have a college degree. I'm being sarcastic. All right. Part of me says that's fine. I happen to have only a bachelor's degree in chemistry when I started. Now I've got a PhD. But I had to pick up the certification. There again is a requirement of the government. Now this is not about economics, but it tells the parents that I have met a certain set of regulations that allow me to be in the classroom. In the state of New York, there's a fingerprint checking. They do a little bit more than when I first started teaching. But again, that's part of where you've got to, for me, you've got to have that. I want to know that the person who's teaching my children or my grandchildren or my great-grandchildren has the background and the skill level. I'll worry about the expertise over time. With Uber, the difficulty with Uber is there's no guarantee. You're trusting in an agency to provide a backing that says this driver is okay. You understand what I'm saying?
And I would say there's good incentive for Uber to do that, because what happens if Uber hires a whole series of bad drivers and they get a reputation that you can't trust Uber? What happens to the company?
Well, the same thing with Yellow Cab in New York City.
What's that?
It would be the same thing with the Yellow Cab in New York City. If they got a string of drivers who could not drive in New York City, there would be a great commuter revolt.
Yeah, and I would argue that that's enough to keep Uber. I mean, the market, that's what I say, with the ability to rate your driver, with the ability to check up on how companies are doing, that's enough in and of itself. Government isn't needed. On the other hand, there are plenty of really bad teachers that are, quote, certified, and we cannot get rid of them because they're terrible. And then what happens is they get bounced from school to school to school, And
that's a topic for another discussion.
yeah, but I'm just saying government certification doesn't really mean that much. It's for one, it's very slow. And for example, I teach college. I teach college and graduate and undergraduate degrees, right? And I've done that for many years. I've gotten great reviews. I'm evidently pretty darn good at it. I'm not allowed to teach in public schools. I can't teach high school. I can't teach below that, except on I actually have, but on a substitute basis, because I don't have the letters behind my name that say I've been certified and blessed that I can actually do that. And I think that's where we run into a lot of problems with government, because the economy changes so quickly that it can't keep up with what's actually needs to happen, and it ends up running for itself as opposed to serving the people. We're about out of time here, so why don't we take a go around real quick for any closing comments, and then we'll wrap it up. So, Chris, we haven't heard from you for a while, so why don't you give us some closing comments? And
you've been talking about American issues, which I was not necessarily up to speed on. I did incidentally take a quick look at the Dodd-Frank Act during that period. Funnily enough, the English experience has been rather different, because we used to have something similar to that, during which period we went to only really having four or five major high street banks, which swallowed all the others, though we did have a lot of what we called building societies, which I think are somewhat like your savings and loans. Then the government repealed that legislation, and suddenly we had almost no savings and loans left, because they all got taken over by the four big banks, apart from, I think there are only about 6 of them left. There used to be 80 or 90. So the effect here of taking away that kind of regulation was that we had an awful lot less choice of where to put our money on the high street. The other effect, of course, was that they allowed the deposit-taking banks to meddle in investment banking for the first time. That made them vulnerable to the horrendous financial markets, and whereas our government was able to ignore Lehman Brothers, which was a pure investment bank, they had to bail out others because they were major deposit-taking banks, and it would have tanked our economy to let them crash on the basis of what their gambling arms had been doing. I considered the government regulating banking is totally necessary to avoid things like the crash. However, we disagree on almost everything, Elgin.
I think we lost him.
Oh dear.
You still there, Elgin? Because what I'm seeing is frozen.
Yeah. Same with me.
Henry, nod your head.
Right. Good.
All right. Henry, I think you're going to have to come on and turn us off.
I think so too. Did you want to do anything to close, Tony?
No, I had this for the benefit of my publisher. This one went better than the last one, because the last one I kept bouncing in and out. It was nice meeting you, Chris. Good to hear you. Yeah. I had the benefit when I was at Memphis State to have a number of English professors, well, the professors were from England.
Yeah.
And we had a discussion one time when we actually had one from Wales too, so there were some very interesting discussions about the English and the Welsh and academics.
Yes.
So, it's a pleasure chatting with you, and
And with you,
I'm
and
going to sign off because I've got a few errands to run today. And I'll be in touch with Henry on the email.
nice talking to you, and I will sign off too.
Okay, Henry, it's all yours.
To you, Henry.